The parent-teacher relationship. Did you know that how parents and teachers communicate actually affects student success? I'm a communication expert. Communication is who I am and what I've done all of my life. I began as a speech-language pathologist, teaching little children how to talk. Then, after 25 years in education, I was an educator and an administrator. I deeply understand the parent-teacher relationship and how it affects teaching and learning. It's all about the conversations. Yet, I know, and I think some of you might know, that some teachers don't have a lot of conversations. Instead, what they do is they tell us. They tell us how our child is doing. They tell us what our child is doing. And they expect parents to be the listener in the conversation, if you want to call it a conversation. And sometimes they jump to conclusions. That's exactly what happened at my first parent-teacher conference. Our daughter, Melissa, was at the time 3 years old, and we were sitting there, my husband and I, listening to her teacher tell us how she was doing. She said that she was bright and articulate and creative. And then her facial expression changed. She looked at us and even pointed her finger. She told us that our daughter had a fine motor problem, that she was the only child in the class that couldn't cut with the scissors. I was taken back. I was confused. And then my husband actually first said to me, well, didn't you tell Miss Jones that you've never given Melissa scissors? That you've never let her cut? Well, at that point, I blurted out, well, of course not. If I gave her a scissors, she'd cut those curls. Now, I was angry. I was angry because her teacher had jumped to conclusions. She had decided that our daughter had a motor problem. You know what she had? She had a lack of exposure problem, and that was my bad. Now, research on parent involvement in education has been going on for decades. And it always comes to the same conclusion. If parents are involved in their children's learning, what happens is student achievement is up, student attendance is up, and students have a better self-esteem. I don't know if you know this or not, but about 50 years ago, Congress passed a law that drives all of special education services even today. And something unique about that law was that they said that parents and educators would have to work together to develop the child's education plan. And they said something else, that parents would have an equal voice in the process. Now, I've sat in hundreds of meetings, and I can tell you that parents don't always have an equal voice in the process. Actually, there are many times that the meetings turn adversarial. The parents don't think their voices are heard. They don't think that their opinions are being considered. You know, the process is sort of broken, or at least it has a giant crack in it. So what can we do? How can we fix it? I suggest that we redefine the parent-teacher relationship and how they communicate. We think of teams and team spirit. However, I don't know about you, but I've sat on many teams where my voice wasn't heard because everybody on a team doesn't really have an equal voice. And the first team I always think of is a sports team. And let's be honest, you've got the players and you've got the coach, and who has the final say? Who's sitting on that bench and who's out there playing? The coach. So we need to redefine how parents and teachers are going to work on that team. And what we need to do is have them start to communicate as partners. And when we communicate partners, that has three very important elements that don't always happen in other conversations. The first element is having deep and meaningful conversations. That means asking questions like what and why and how. And then, you know what? Asking more questions about what and why and how. And secondly, as partners, you need to be an active listener. A lot of times when we're in a conversation, we're not really listening to the conversation and doing anything. What we're doing is listening for a pause in the conversation. Yeah, you've been there. And you know, what do? And then you jump into the conversation and you tell what you were going to say. Active listeners have to listen and they have to build on what the other person is saying. And they have to add to the conversation. They say, wow, what if? Or yes, and only we should. And they ask questions. If they're not sure, they say, well, explain that to me, or can you say it another way? And when something very important they do is they take the words yes, but, and they leave that at the door. That can't be a part of a conversation if you're an active listener. It stops the conversation. And number three, what we have to do is we have to have empathy if we're going to be a partner. We have to be able to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, see the problem through the other person's eyes. And when we do that, we have empathy and we're perspective taking. Doesn't mean we agree, we just understand. Now, that reminds me of Sammy when I was an administrator at his meeting. Sammy's parents thought that he was a struggling reader, and his teacher thought he was doing fine. So what happened? They were not really agreeing, and his parents wanted him tested. So I knew that they had to form a partnership. And what I knew was they needed to have some evidence, because it's much harder to argue with evidence or data when you're having a conversation. I asked the parents to come back with data and the teacher to come back with data, and that's what they did. And the parents brought a great short video of Sammy reading a book that was actually below his grade level, and he was struggling to read that. And his teacher, she brought his writing journal. On the beginning, you could see he was struggling. And then, as the journal progressed, his parents saw that he was making progress. They saw the most recent entry in his journal, and wow, they understood now. They understood the teacher's perspective, and guess what? The teacher understood the parents' perspective. And together, they worked as partners. They agreed to evaluate Sammy, and they found that he did have some gaps in his learning and needed some help. Sammy was the winner because of a partnership. Partnerships don't always have to do with academics. Sometimes it has to do with how a child is doing socially and emotionally. And so that's what happened with Jason. I knew Jason when he was 3 years old, and you know how verbal 3-year-olds can be. He asked questions, and he was excited to learn. Well, fast forward, now Jason's in 4th grade. Mr. Smith, first beginning of school, Jason's just like I knew Jason. He was out there doing everything, asking questions, involved in classroom conversations, doing well on his schoolwork. Suddenly, Jason started to withdraw. He stopped asking questions. He actually did poorly on his math test, and math was his favorite subject. Mr. Smith knew that what he needed to do was to contact Mrs. Sanchez, Jason's mom. He called her, he asked her what was going on at home, and she said, nothing, everything's fine. Mr. Smith knew he had to form a partnership, and partnerships mean that the other person has to trust you. And so he had several conversations. He even invited her in for some coffee and conversation. Finally, Mrs. Sanchez reluctantly decided she needed to tell Jason's teacher what was happening. And culturally, this was very hard for her, but she knew that Jason was struggling and it would be the only way. She formed a partnership and she shared with Mr. Smith. My mother lives in Mexico and she's gravely ill and dying of cancer. Jason has spent every year with my mother since he was 2 years old. He's afraid he'll never see his grandmother again. And Mr. Smith knew that now he had a way to partner with her, with his mom, with Jason's mom, and so he did. He helped Mom get resources for Jason at home. He brought in a psychologist to do a lesson in the class about death and dying, and he got Jason some counseling at school. Together, as a partner, Jason's grades started to go up because he was now available to learn, because he was getting the skills he needed to deal with the grief that he was feeling. Let me tell you about Maria. When she was 2 years old, she was already diagnosed with need for special education. Her parents and teachers never really agreed. Maria's parents decided that the best way to educate her was with one-to-one instruction, and so they put her in a private special education program in a nearby town. Now, the teachers thought that Maria could learn and learn well with her neurotypical peers in some parts of her day and didn't need one-on-one instruction. However, they could never agree. Fast forward, Maria's ready to come to first grade, and they brought me into the conversation because they thought I was always my job was to bring people who were outplaced back, and maybe I could help them partner on this. As soon as I entered the room, I could feel the tension. And I knew that it was going to take a lot more than just telling them to form a partnership. So I said, first of all, I want everyone to trust me. And I want you to know that I'm going to be involved in this conversation. It's not going to be about what the district wants to offer, and it's not going to be what the parents want. It's going to be all about what Maria needs. And so, together, we formed a partnership. We had conversations, and we did observations, and we built a program. We created a program that was far better than the one that probably would have been done. And the parents brought Maria back. She did well. I was at her end of the year meeting, and I could see the pride in the parents' face. As I walked out of the door, the father followed me. He said, Peggy, I just want to thank you. You're a woman of your word. You asked us to trust you, and we did. And so Maria is now flourishing. She's not just flourishing academically, she's flourishing socially. I did feel, wow, why can't all parents form partnerships? And then I want to leave you with this thought, because my answer is they can. They can and form partnerships if they just redefine that parent-teacher relationship and they start communicating as partners, deep conversations, active listening, and also empathy. And if they do all of that, you know what? Our children will be the winner. Thank you.